Hi, I'm Sam Curry, the CISO and SVP at Zscaler, and today we're going to be talking about securing the autonomous workforce. You can almost think of AI coming into the workforce as silicon workers being added to our carbon workforce. Ideally, what we want to do is to create a new trust framework, a new way of doing trust in this environment, and looking at how do we get efficiencies and effectiveness in that environment, and how do we get trust in that environment when it's really going to be augmenting the workforce. Cyber is one of those domains, or information security is one of those domains where we have an active opponent. And something I've said in the past, especially if you want to look it up, is something called mirror chess, is automation when you have an active, intelligent opponent, whether it's carbon or silicon based, can be a weakness. It can be a source of issues because the opponent can both test what you're doing and then use that predictability to their advantage. Just as in chess, if you mirror your opponent, that can be a bad strategy. And so it begs us to say, how do we intelligently use things like automation and things like non-deterministic programming, in other words, the artificial intelligence toolkit, how do we do that correctly and integrate the silicon and carbon for machine assisting humans in defense? So with that, let's actually take a deeper look here for a little bit. Let's start with zero trust foundational principles. I'll start at the business level, and then we'll go a little bit deeper on the technical side, and then we'll move into AI as well. Zero trust is a term that is often abused and misused by marketing folks, but I think we can say that it is effectively provisioning only what's needed by the business, only for as long as it's needed, and as much as possible, minimizing. That word minimizing is incredibly important. I think in security, I'm as guilty of this as anyone rather. We want to talk about absolutes. We want to try and make it as close to zero as possible, but really it's about reducing in shades of gray. It's about getting closer to zero over time and being on a path to do that. The word only in my definition is the hard part, only allowing the business or provisioning the business what it needs, only for as long as it needs and when and where it needs it. The only part is the hard part. What we really want to do is to say that the internet replaces private networks. We want to commoditize the network. It should be an inexpensive and reliable connective medium and no more than that. We also want to treat every branch in an organization like an internet cafe. In other words, it should be not just secure, but also simple as infrastructure, able to support complexity. Not complicated, but able to support complexity. And every resource should be as invisible as possible, no or as few public IPs as you can have. And that requires a transformation of mindset. As I promised, we'll get a little bit more technical. I think of it in terms of 5 principles underlying all of it. Now, everyone knows the identity side, the least privilege part. And the word least, again, appears several times on this slide. It is about least privilege. It is about removing privilege where it's not needed because access is proportional to risk. The more access that you leave open is the more the doors that can be forced through by an opponent or misused by anyone. Now, if we talk about infrastructure, we also want least exposure. The less that is available to be hacked or visible or seen, then the less options there are for an attacker. As we've seen in the world of AI, when it's applied to things like chess and Go, entirely new attack types emerge over time. And actually, we see entirely new vectors. In Go, opening moves, you'll actually see on the board there's 361 intersections. There are 9 emphasized points because moves tend to open around those points. And when a stone is laid, there's a optimal strategy for what to deploy called a joseki to minimize and maximize gains and losses for black and white stones on the board. But when the AI is introduced to the equation, it opens in strange places that are not making sense to human beings. It's not narrative-based learning or narrative evolution of the game. In other words, it comes where there are no joseki. In that analogy for us, there are ways of putting together things like medium vulnerabilities that add up in ways we don't expect, parts of the infrastructure that can be attacked in ways we don't expect. And to continue that analogy, it means least exposure must remove intersections and choices for the AI-enabled attacker to be able to come into an environment. Now, data, I put least information here. Claude Shannon from Pac Bell Labs many years ago came up with a wonderful, if you want to look it up, there's a wonderful information theory where you actually can tell the presence of signal or its opposite, entropy. You can tell the presence of signal purely based on the probability of being able to predict what comes next from an information perspective. Now, we use that in cryptography to tell when something's encrypted when there isn't a flag in the traffic type that says, hey, this is encrypted. So maybe it says it's not encrypted, but actually the payload is. You can flip it around and use it for the inverse, which is to find signal or information. And we in an infrastructure should be minimizing the amount of information that's present, or rather the information state, maximizing the entropy of data in that environment. An application. applications themselves over time will accumulate more and more function. Think of APIs that grow in richness, whether or not you're aware of it. And so what we should do is only put the functions that are required in there for the job to be done. And last but not least, I've spoken elsewhere on this as well, is negative trust. The notion of deception applied at scale. So the attacker is hesitant and has some hesitation when moving in the environment because each moment could slow them down and send a signal to defenders. These are really important design principles. Zero trust is not a product, it's not a service, it's not a feature. These are principles that can be built into any security strategy or any design and any architecture that you approach. So what does that do? Well, we can secure things like transient and distributed workloads. We can enforce things like contextual least privilege naturally. We can also automate things like continuous threat management. We can also ensure scalability and minimize the attack and exposure surface. These are vital things to be able to do in any infrastructure. And so now we introduce a little bit more. AI. AI is a force multiplier for both the attackers and the defenders in infrastructure. It enables bad actors, of course. And we see this. Today we see things like advanced malware evasion, phishing and personalization, and deep fakes. We've all heard the horrible stories of deep fakes on Zooms and on things like Teams and meetings, where every person in it potentially could be a construct, not a real person, and represented by AI. But also data poisoning and things like probabilistic password modeling and ransomware target optimization, finding the ways of modeling the optimal attacks for ransomware. But what's coming is more. First of all, we have automated exploit frameworks that we're already seeing to some degree, just starting deep social engineering kits that go far beyond that, new ways of doing malware builders and adaptive botnets, and also jailbreak as a service. But having said that, we also have things that are assisting the defenders. We have SOC copilots, which abound and are in many, many places. Be forewarned, though, that there's such a thing as leaky abstraction. We don't want things to become too predictable, by which I mean we don't want to both have machine overlearning that likes to feed the humans, and we don't want humans to be used to getting the food that they get. We need to always be shaking it up a bit to look where we are not necessarily always staring. Automated rapid scripting is very important so that we can kind of get a SecOps revolution, much like the DevOps revolution, so that development isn't needed in the loop and we can actually go faster and focus on the task rather than the tool. If you could ask questions without having to think of the scripting language, you could do things much more iteratively and quickly. And integrating DevSecOps, of course, but we're also talking about finding and doing correlation and anomaly detection much more effectively. I've already mentioned deception, so I won't belabor it, but also AI-powered malware detection. And as we go forward, we're looking at autonomous threat hunting copilots, autonomous and even semi-autonomous. I'm going to talk a little bit today about agentic AI. And so we're already seeing that. It's already in play to some degree, but also a new version of UEBA. We can now look at, and we need to filter out the two kinds of players in the workforce, both the carbon and the silicon-based. Self-healing agents, AI-driven patch and misconfig prioritization as we look at what are the pathways and how do we do things, and also adaptive moving target orchestration. So as things change and get more dynamic, especially with the introduction of agentic, where we go from static objects that are talking to each other through APIs to dynamic objects that sometimes represent the same entities or chains of trust and how they interact with one another. So this may look a little confusing. It shouldn't be. This basically says the carbon and the silicon, when combined, is greater than the sum of the parts. Or at least that's what I was going for when I said this. So now we've got this new entrant into the workforce. And it took us thousands of years to figure out how to work with humans. We've only had about, if I'm generous, 5 to work with AI. I don't consider machine learning in the same bucket, although it is in the AI toolkit because it is non-deterministic programming. But I do consider LLMs and on to be in that. So what makes something agentic? Look at that because I talked about it earlier. First of all, it is goal-driven. And secondly, it's context-aware and it is action orchestration. It has the ability, in other words, to make a decision and to take action. It can assess and then act on behalf of you, hence agent. It is agentic. And this is, if not autonomy, it's at least semi-autonomy. So self-initiated decisions and scripts and continuing learning. And so it actually behaves in a way that makes it, you could infer intent. It is trying to follow a path and to achieve some goals. It's goal execution, not simply task execution. And it has this notion of a partnership emerging. Now we may go on to AGI, and I suspect that will both take longer and be shorter than we expect in some ways, and there may be some steps in between. But we're going to have humans set intent, agents executing, supervisory control, and AIs amplifying human expertise. That's the ideal. That's where we want to get to. What does this do? Well, it will reshape life and work. This is fairly straightforward. I think things like workforce and jobs now, there's a lot of concern, of course, about what this will do to jobs. As with most revolutions, it will change the nature of work. But those things that require a dialogue, that require an interaction, that use specialization on the two, and those things that have to do with intelligent opponents in particular, like cyber, but also, by the way, like sales or legal or some other functions where you have an opponent, they are going to benefit from and require special adaptation in particular. Also, business of the economy. I think we're going to see, and we already have seen, massive generation of content and implications for new revenue streams, cost savings via automation, and so on. But that doesn't mean it just works right away. I think we have already seen things like the way it's worked in gaming and the way it's worked in adversarial intelligence world. So things like hallucination are still a problem. These have to be tuned and applied, and it can be done quite effectively. But also, we have to start thinking about ethics by design. These frameworks are on the rise, but they're still not there. And while there's some policies that are out there, there's more to come. And of course, we have to think about how zero trust is mandated at the moment by agencies, how we get to autonomous cyber ops, and there's an AI arms race going on right now. So there's a lot happening around AI. And this leads us to the question of course, how do we build a new trust framework for that? Now, in the early days, we used to talk about authentication, and I'm at Zscaler now, but back in the day, I was the CTO at RSA. I used to joke I was the CTO for the world's largest keychain maker because it was all about a crunchy perimeter. And I loved Secure ID, but it was an authentication system. For all the backend did some authorization. Really, Zscaler and other companies as well have gotten into the authorization game about what can and should you do. Now we're heading into a world of authenticity. It is about chains of authenticity and proving that something has the right to act on behalf of something else in a verifiable way. Now, keep in mind, most people don't even read the end user license agreements. So what we've got to do is get to the point where we have not checking back on every check, because that'll become a de facto yes. But we are in a world where we may have hundreds of agents acting on our behalf, just as we have lawyers and we have accountants and we have doctors who act on our behalf every day in the carbon-based world. We could have hundreds of silicon, if not more, agents acting on our behalf, and authenticity has to be checked. And they may drift apart and they may come into conflict with one another, and that has to be resolved as well. And so there are some challenges and emerging risks around agentic AI, right? So we have in the past, we had machine learning, and the challenge there was cross-channel insight, and there were some solutions that emerged. In particular, things like fraud, it was applied very well to. And we had identity-based entity correlation. We had multimodal machine learning analytics. That was before, and that's been going on for over 20 years. In fact, some applications were things like anti-malware and doing things like URL filtering and fuzzy logic. Now we get to the present. We have just had LLMs, and we're just basically absorbing them, and now we're going straight into agentic. That's the present. This is already happening. And I would emphasize, by the way, that this track of disruption is the milestones are coming faster. And so you could think of it as an acceleration of disruptions. So we've gone from large data sets where we had to worry about things like who trains the data? Where does it come from? What are the implications? What are the privacy implications? Who are the companies behind it? To now agentic authenticity is in fact the issue. And what is the audit log, and how do we check that it actually represents something? And does it have the right to do something on someone's behalf? In the future, AGI, and I put plus plus here because we're going to get into the world perhaps of full autonomy as opposed to semi-autonomy. Is there a manual override? Is there an instant kill switch? And what are the ethics of that world, which we should be addressing right now? So going from authorization to an authenticity exchange is going to require us doing some new things, in particular, accountability and governance. And so as you here are listening to this and watching this, I would emphasize in accountability and governance, making sure you have an executive owner and a charter, that you have built-in ethics and compliance, and that you're thinking about these questions now, that you have policy guardrails and escalation points. We had that with LLMs. Think about it for agentic and going forward for AGI as well. And the ethical, social, and psychological principles guide that governance. Culture is critical. And ethics isn't just an argument over right and wrong. State the frameworks that you're using. Is it utilitarianism? Is it Kantism? Is it negative consequentialism? If you don't state a framework, it is just an argument. So you must state what it is that you're trying to achieve. And this can be done. This is one of those strange instances where philosophy majors are suddenly making a lot of money in Silicon Valley. It's worth talking to some people that have thought about ethics from a philosophy perspective. And then security and operational controls. Zero trust controls are needed for authorization, of course, but also make sure the authenticity seals prove provenance. We need this chain of trust, this trust framework for these new carbon entrants into the workspace, not replacing. This is a silicon entrance joining the carbon players already in the workforce. It is a new trust model required for them to work together and to divide the labor correctly. So all the monitoring in here to detect things like anomalies is going to change. Humans behave a certain way at human speeds. They make certain kinds of errors. And now agents are going to act on their behalf with their identities. We need to find a way to discriminate between when an agent's acting on behalf of somebody versus when it isn't. Think of monitoring and logging and UEBA. That's the 2.0 part. And that's what we've got to do in security and operational controls. And this is a doable thing, but the architecture and the design has to be done now. And it's important to think about zero trust. Now, this is a fun story I'll do fairly quickly. This is The Dark Forest, and some of you may be fans of Cixin Liu's Three Body Problem. The second book in the series is called The Dark Forest. I myself am looking forward to the next season on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, it's worth it. This dates back to Enrico Fermi in the Manhattan Project, who at lunch, because they're thinking of radiation, asked the question, where are they? And what he was asking is, where are the aliens? And some of you may be chuckling at that, but it was a fair question. And Drake would later come up with Drake's equation, a linear equation to determine the likelihood of intelligent life out there. And most interpretations of it, Carl Sagan famously said it was a low probability from that equation, but most say we should be hearing alien civilizations. So the question is, where are they? Well, one of those theories that explains it is called the dark forest. There's many. Some are that species wipe themselves out before they get to that point, or they poison the petri dish with things like climate change. But the dark forest is a different one. It says the first species into interstellar space realizes it's pretty good out there, and it turns predatory, and the universe, or at least the galaxy, is effectively a dark forest with predators in it. And I would put this forward. The internet is becoming a dark forest, and it requires a strategy that handles that. In other words, just as we probably shouldn't be broadcasting into space, that there's these delicious things called humans and a lot of water on the third planet from our sun, we also probably shouldn't be just going out there and broadcasting IP addresses everywhere. And so with that strategy, you should be able to handle a lot of disruptors that are coming. A zero trust strategy with the principles I've laid out is going to help you on that AI track with those milestones that are coming more frequently with potentially greater impact. But what if we had another disruptor at the same time as one of those milestones? There are other tracks besides artificial intelligence, and I've listed a few here. There are others. Things like quantum computing, nanotechnology, robotics, synthetic biology, synthetic manufacturing. Each of them has the potential to be just as disruptive as LLMs were in 2023. And could you imagine what it would have been like in 2023 if we'd had not just LLMs, but say a breakthrough in quantum computing at the same time? In other words, the disruptors together are greater than the sum of the disruptors apart. And so having a zero trust strategy is a way of making yourself more resilient to future disruptions, of which AI is a biggie, but it's not the only one. Having said that, I'd like to thank you for listening through this, and I hope it's been helpful. The entrance of silicon-based intelligence into the carbon workforce, it is going to be game-changing in many ways, only some of which I've touched on just in the barest way today. But it does require a new way to think about trust. It does require us to think about how we do security and governance. And if that is something that you took away from today, I'm very grateful, and I hope to hear from you soon if you have any questions or comments. Thank you for your time.